2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, in today's debate, the topic is that we are going to impoverish corruptors, and we believe that we should do this. Now, first of all, let us clarify a few things and a few parameters that we should set in order to speak about this debate. Now, the kind of corruptors that we meant that will be punished by impoverishment is corruptors who have stolen billions or a huge amount of money from our country in order to enrich themselves. And by impoverishment, this means that we will give them a fine and take away their assets in order to make them pay back the amount of money and more of what they have already stolen. The first question that this raises is the justification behind this. When you do something wrong, ladies and gentlemen, especially something as big as corrupting your country's wealth in order to enrich themselves, then naturally you should be prepared for the consequences when you're caught. So we are using this principle of justice here. When you do the crime, you should be prepared to commit the time. And this is the principle that we're going to use. The second concern that this raises is how are we going to set the parameter and how big of a fine or punishment that we should give these corruptors. Ladies and gentlemen, naturally, the punishment will be defined by how big of amount of money they have already stolen. Like, for example, if a certain person corrupts a certain amount of money, then the money they have to pay back will be equal to 150% of what they have stolen. Ladies and gentlemen, in the current status quo, we have seen everywhere around the world, save a few countries, where corruptors escape punishment just with a slap in the wrist. That punishment is oftentimes light, and not only that, only a few of them actually have to pay back the money that they've already stolen. So not only is it detrimental to the people, it is also naturally detrimental to the government because these kind of people are not deterred by these kind of punishment. As soon as they want out of the prison, we can see many cases of people repeatedly corrupting over and over again, and yet still they escape with a slap in the wrist. Naturally, we do not want this to happen, ladies and gentlemen. We want corruptors to be deterred. We want to prevent any corruption case to happen in the future. How will we impoverish them? So this didn't happen at all. The most important aspect of punishment is, of course, we want to give deterrence for these criminals. When we punish them, the goal here is to make them regret it. The goal here is to make them not want to repeat the offense that they've already did. And the status quo already failed us multiple times. However, we believe that by impoverishing them by the way of fine and paying more than 100% of what they've already stolen, we will actually not only deter them but also give compensation to the nation. Not only will this prevent them from doing it again, but because they're already impoverished, then they will no longer have the power or will be in the position of power in order to commit these crimes ever again. Naturally, ladies and gentlemen, we will not impoverish them so badly that they will not be able to feed themselves. So we are only going to impoverish them so that they are all in the point that they are all only like regular everyday people. Not only will this deter them, this will actually rehabilitate them because now they know how us normal people live, and so they will realize what kind of wrongdoings that have already stolen, how bad it is to steal from people who actually need it. Corruptors who enrich themselves and corruptors who are rich politicians, they are not like us normal people, so they do not know our struggle, they do not know our pain, and this rehabilitation will help them from preventing them to become a worse person than they already are. This kind of punishment is also very effective, ladies and gentlemen, in order to prevent other criminals from doing the same things, because like I've said previously, in the status quo, a lot of corruptors went away from the punishment with just a slap in the wrist. And when they see this example, of course, they will be salivating for opportunities for other aspiring politicians. Because when they see the examples of their fellow corruptors corrupting and then escaping just with a slap in the wrist, this will give them a motivation. Because, of course, they will be thinking that, hey, if a politician can escape with a slap at the wrist, then I too also escape with a slap in the wrist. This is something that we've seen a lot of times, ladies and gentlemen, like I've said before, in the status quo. That, however, we think that impoverishing them by giving them a harsh punishment like this house supports it. This will, of course, prevent them because they can see firsthand that doing this is very, very bad. Not only for them, but also for the people, because now they can not only escape with a slap of the wrist. Because now they have the knowledge of a hard punishment, and also impoverishing them with fine and also demanding that they paid what they stole in order to deter them and prevent them from doing this kind of act ever again. Ladies and gentlemen, another question is that how will this protect the vulnerable actors, such as the poor people that is in need of the government's help? In need of this money that these corruptors have selfishly stolen. Like I've said before in our mechanism, not only are we going to find them, we're also going to make them pay back more than 100% from what they have stolen. Naturally, this will of course make them pay back from what they have stolen, and not only that, this will also increase the government's money that can be used in order to support this vulnerable actor via healthcare, welfare, and whatsoever. Like I've said before, this is also a preventative and deterrence mechanism, and so this will also prevent and deter other people in order not to commit these acts, and also protect these vulnerable actors much more better. Now, naturally, of course, if we do this means that these vulnerable actors will get much more help from the government that they need, instead of these people and characters or corruptors who only enrich themselves. In comparison, in the opposite side of the house, in the current status quo, like I've stated previously, a lot of these corruptors escape with just a slap in the wrist, and not only do they not have to pay for this corruption back, they can even bribe their way out of prison. In comparison, in our side of the house, this will prevent them and deter them and stop them from doing any corruption from ever happening again. That is all for my speech as a Prime Minister. Thank you all for your attention, and I am very, very proud to propose.
Alright, I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel, 2 things we want to focus on today's debate. First, the purpose of criminal justice system, and second, to prove why the Gov case isn't based on a status quo and they fail to reach the purpose of criminal justice system, right? So moving on to the setup on our side, we believe that places where there are more corruptors are less developed countries. So you cannot survive without being corrupt, or you won't be able to be the leaders in the first place. And second, impoverishing means making them into poverty, living below the poverty line. This looks like you're not even employed, you have no sources of income to afford you, and you have to beg on streets, and not having proper sanitation, lack of food, etc. This is likely to need to be very severe, to the point where no normal human being will be able to take it if opposition wants to achieve the truest impact of their case, right? So what is the counterfactual on our side then? We actually tackle corruptors instead of letting them scot-free using pre-existing punishment procedures, right? So few rebuttals. So the rebuttals to Gov deterrence case is that, for example, even though there is death sentence for murder, people still do it. So there will always be corruptors on both sides. The harm is symmetrical. Even if we concede that there's less corruptors on Gov, the outcome produced by the corruptors are far worse. So I think Gov should also know that the primary role of the criminal justice system isn't just for the sake of retribution. It is meant to protect the public, deter crimes, and reintroduce previous felons into society. Basically, the focus isn't to punish, it is to build the compliance to law and order in people, so you have an optimally functioning society, right? So since rehab and all other criminal reintegration campaigns that see criminals who have previously served their sentence get re-employed into government assigned jobs, the argument should be pretty initiated from here. The goal of the CJS is not to absolutely destroy the life of people. For example, the abolition of death penalty in multiple states. It is a principal misalignment to the goal of CJS. So why is it worse on Gov side then? First, because the goal of the CJS is to reintegrate. Impoverishing on their side removes virtually any chances of you becoming a functioning member of the society. So side government downplay what it means to get impoverished. You're fighting to your limits on a daily basis just to get barely enough food to survive the day. You have no shelter and are subject to malnourishment and have no money to afford the basic resources you need. So 2 things concluded from the PM to defend this punishment. They think that first, the protection of victim, right? So it is actually not the CJS responsibility to protect the victim closure. The victim can't even decide the sentence for themselves, so you're giving a 5-year sentence for an assailant isn't going to entirely provide the victim closure, but it is what it is, right? So second, the proportional punishment. However, we think that this is not true, because taking away food security is unjust. Corruption is bad, and we already have jail time and fines, which will be sufficient if we actually implement it. Since the incentive of people is extreme wealth and luxury, where jail and fines do take that away to some extent, however, putting someone into poverty means missing meal and unsanitary condition. Even in jail for murder, we argue for basic human right, guarantee that they at least have enough food to not lose weight. So the state doesn't have the right to take away this elementary rights. This is why we don't support death penalty, even if murder is the worst possible crime ever. So even if punishment might be necessary, there is a bottom line to argue what rights we can infringe and what rights are innate to human beings regardless of what they have done. And second, this involves their families too. Unlike jail time, where their family can still survive to some extent, taking away all their wealth to the point of poverty, instead of asking them to pay back 3 times of what they took, makes their family fall in poverty too, especially when the men are the breadwinners of the family. So this looks like children not having access to education, malnutrition due to the lack of food, and also a lot of unimaginable situations, right? So these are stuff that families should never be subjected to. Unlike fines and jail time, someone being in poverty is very and absolutely likely to put their immediate families in such situations too, which is then very unjust in the sense where we are pushing the innocent for something that they have never controlled of. So the Gov wants to defend it to the small minority of corruptors, but what happens to the other people who didn't impoverish people as a result of their corruption? So Gov wants the people to starve and place in mercy of others to afford even a scrap of food. So Gov wants their children to be displaced with them and not get to experience a decent education, to learn and become functioning adults of their own. So third, we believe that it is the state's obligation. So the state has always tried to eliminate poverty regardless of the race and regardless of who you are, right? So the general narrative is that poverty is something no one should go through. But if the state now picks and chooses who goes to poverty, this sets the narrative that only good people deserve to be out of poverty. Although this narrative might be gradual, however, when the state legitimizes optional poverty elevation, this translates into the people's belief that they often use state as a standard. So this means that it is easier to justify not helping a certain group of people, which are often perceived as criminals, lazy or less deserving. So this impoverishment isn't proportional for all reasons. So first, because impoverishment is likely way more worse than whatever this corruption is. And second, there's a third party harm, specifically to the young children I point out previously, of the corruptors to the punishment. So Gov wants to take away a children's future from their own eyes, not giving them an education, adequate food or shelter, and live through strife from a young age, all because their mother embezzled funds from the company budget to a personal bank account. We think that this is totally unjust. And we also think that impoverishing corruptors actually worsens corruption. Why? First, because the packet corruption is dealt with. People think that corrupted people are already punished insofar as to unlucky candidates without central backing up approach. So this blocks out any other government incentive to tackle corruption. But in fact, people are not getting punished. Most of them not at all will be impoverished, especially those with ties with the government. So our counterfactual to continue the push is better. The likelihood tackling corruption is better when the facade of tokenistic punishment to those comparatively vulnerable corruptors. So also we can tackle the corruptors better. People are more likely to call out and more likely to give attention to these issues and more likely to protest. And second, it is more like people are more likely going to hide corruption, right? If all knows that the consequences of getting found out, this will be the tipping point for all politicians and business owners immediately to set up prevention measures such as hiding certain data that might be suspected of corruption, refusing third-party checks on the accounts just in case past corruptions are found out. The incentive to be corrupt will still be there because people often think that they won't be found out, and the optimism bias is that they are still often willing to take the risk to achieve that money, power that blinds them. On or without this impoverishment, we are more likely able to convict them since this is pre-existing. So it does not takes up as much attention, right? So and also the consequences of getting jail is insufficient for a huge movement of hiding corruption. However, jail is enough because we think that these individuals out of some scene from being able to harm us and to give them sufficient and proportionate punishment. With all that, side with all.
My time will start in 3, 2, We ought not to excuse those who have taken away from the poor and the suffering that the exact corruptors in which side opposition wants to defend have committed. Justice is needed to save a nation and to further deter those from corruption. The best metric in which to exist is to take away the money that they incentivize the corruptors and use it as reparation. Therefore, you should side with OG. 3 questions from the opening half, right? First, whether punishment is going to be possible. 2 responses to that. A, it is not a part of our burden to defend and to argue whether we will be able to locate the corruptors or not, right? Because it is symmetric on both sides. On your world, the correct counterfactual to stand would be implementing ways of punishment or the rehabilitation that you said. It is never going to be whether we can correctly locate corruptors, because on your side, if you are unable to locate corruptors either, right? So therefore, this does not stand. But B, it is worse off on your side because we impoverish them and we take away a large sum of money back. Only leave them and out in the world, right? And they will be able to take something back from them. And even if we're unable to locate them, we're able to see how much money that they have taken away, unlike your side, where you're not going to do anything. But second question, what do we think about families, right? We think that this is symmetrical on your side because the moment that the corruptors are found out and the corruptors are likely going to be exposed in ways, their family are also going to suffer from the impact of media, right? Because you can never argue the exposure to not exist on your side. We say that this is going to be symmetrical, right? But moreover, we think that these kind of measures are not going to be extreme and the families are never going to be part of the stakeholders, right? Because the thing is, if you have a father who likes to gamble, likely the family will also be impoverished from the effect that he has done. We think that in order for him to be further deterred from his gambling addiction and for him to actually realize his own issues, he has to be taken away of his wealth and he has to have this realization that are taken away from him, right? Ultimately, you cannot defend this metric to be extreme because in the status quo, there are already many families suffering from the consequences of their counterparts. Ultimately, we also think that at the point in which a corruptor has decided to commit those exact crimes, they have to realize the impact that they are going to bring to their family. They're going to sacrifice their family, and this is going to be something that they have to also take down, and they have to also put that into consideration the moment that they have decided to corrupt. But third question, will rehabilitation work, right? 3 responses to that. First, you never respond to our entire reparation line, right? They need to be paid back some way. But on your counterfactual, you're only saying that, oh, they're going to be sent into rehabilitation, but you never talk about the most vulnerable stakeholder in this case, right? We think that the most vulnerable people that we're going to be talking about is the poor that are taken away from their welfare system, is the people who has to suffer from the lack of money coming from the nation, right? Ultimately, you have to do something in order to repair them from their damage. But second response is that you can never measure the effect of rehabilitation on your side, right? They will never change, unlike the violent crime committers, because the effect of rehabilitation is going to still is not going to be existent on your side. The thing is, you still keep the incentive for them to commit, right? This world ultimately works under money, and we think that those corruptors, they have never committed because of impulse or anything like that, right? They're driven by money, and this is something that rehabilitation can never fix. And I do not necessarily know why side opposition stands upon such a wishy-washy line saying that somehow rehabilitation will solve everything and will take away all of the incentive that has prompted them to commit, right? But the final response to this is that you still using the line that you have said yourself from side opposition about how, oh, you can never change corruptors, right? Ultimately, we think that it plays to take down your counterfactual, right? Because you are still able, you can never change the corruptor's incentive. And we think that this was not proven from your side. But ultimately, by still giving money, and by still leaving money in the hands of the corruptors, you're still giving them some kind of status and some kind of money to which leads them to live a happy life and to be able to somehow come back and corrupt again, right? We think that ultimately by leaving power and by leaving money and by still leaving resources in the status quo, you ultimately don't deter them from doing anything and you give them no consequence at all. We think that this debate has to be under some kind of metric that is going to provide reparation and going to provide punishment. This is because we still need other people and we still need other potential corruptors to see that this is wrong and this nation cannot be corrupted. Side opposition stands upon a very soft line stance and talk about how, oh, rehabilitation will work for those who have already committed, but we think that they can never work towards those who will potentially commit, whereas by taking away money and by impoverishing those who have committed will ultimately deter other people from committing. So moving into the extension on why is justice through the metric of money and reparation, right? We think that, what do we think reparation is? We think that they have tried to take away from the nation and their for their own benefit. So they have to give reparation to those who have exactly to them. So however, this cannot be just paying back, and this has to be more than paying back. This has to be impoverishment. They have to learn and to reflect upon their own greed, right? This is something necessary for them. And the immediate, like immeasurable pain that they have went through has to be paid back in some way. They have taken away from those who lives under time, who have lived under the lack of welfare, and they have to somehow pay it back to those who have suffered. Therefore, money comes as the kind of metric for the reason that A, money got taken away from them and from their welfare system, so causing the pain, so money has to be paid back, right? But B, it is money that can buy for their well-being, right? So the amount of welfare, the amount of money that those poor get means that they're going to be benefited back. So therefore, we think that money has to be the justification, and we think that reparation is needed, and therefore proudly propose as OG.
Right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think what is problematic under side government bench is that they give principles that exactly not justified in the very first place. And they only give more burden to the state, which I will actually explain to you under my speech, right? Reparation panels is when you solve the root of why these corruptors want to corrupt the state and not putting more capital to actually cater more impoverished people inside the state, right? But 2 things I'm going to bring under my speech. Firstly, why their mechanism is actually not effective, but then secondly, why their principal case is not justified in the very first place, right? But before that, a couple of framings for government bench. Firstly, proposition frame their mechanism as something that is perfect, right? They frame that, oh, if this property is corrupt for this amount of money, they will also take their properties for that amount plus a couple of percent, right? What they have ignored is that financial agency that take care of the analysis of the research of the loss that these corruptors take in from the state still have human errors, still have technical errors, especially when the amount of corruption is massive and these powerful corruptors still have other links to abolish tax under the with their other corruptions, right? But then second, framing them impoverished corruptors, meaning that you made them to be an impoverished person, low class person that now government need to take care of now, because under their bench these corruptors now are unemployed and are impoverished in the very first place, right? Moving to the first thing I'm going to. No, thank you. Why actually their mechanism is not effective, right? Their whole their PM speech is about giving deterrence for these corruptors, right? But let me tell you, impoverishing them meaning even if you gave them deterrence, impoverish them, meaning more burden to the state, right? Now that they have to take care more impoverished people under their state, more capital that state need to provide to cater these impoverished people, right? This is not effective at all, right? Because corruptors already steal a lot from the state. Now state don't have to actually have the responsibility to give more capital to take care of the now impoverished ex-corruptors, right? But then two things then. Firstly, even if government bench do not want to give welfare for these corruptors, to these now impoverished ex-corruptors, they will still be a burden for the state because now they are unemployed and need to still pay daily needs for themselves or even their family. Two things they will do is that A, do corruption again. Well, that will be fortunate if they get a job after the social punishment be labeled as a corruptor. But then secondly, they will do petty crimes like stealing or others, makes them have to put way more capital towards jails or even police cops and etc. etc. Right? No, thank you. But then secondly, when they notice that foreclosure, taking away their properties under with their mechanism is not a general punishment, right? It only apply under certain case, which means in order for the state to foreclose to be apply in when to take all of the properties, right? For example, money laundering or massive bribery is the one case that you actually have to foreclosure, right? But not all type of corruption will be punished, right? Small amount of corruption will not be punished because the amount that they steal cannot trigger the state to foreclose their properties in the very first place, right? So what is the comparative? We give you an alternative of rehabilitation, right? Rehabilitation will work, right? Because why? Firstly,
LTOI.
we solve the root. Later, we solve the root of why they want to corrupt, right? Under our side, we prevent these corruptors to actually corrupt more or even to do other crimes that will actually not benefiting the state, right? But before moving to the second point, I'll pick your POI.
All right. First of all, in my speech, I have never stated anything about not punishing small-time corruptors. I only said that impoverishing them, aka those kind of hard punishment, is only going to be applied to big-time corruptors. I have never said anything about not punishing small one.
Yes, that is exactly what is problematic under their mechanism, right? Not their mechanism is only going to punish a certain case in a certain corruption, right? But not other corruption, not the small type of corruption, right? The corruption that they will only punish is the like corruption which includes money laundering, massive money laundering, or massive bribery, right? Then the corruption inside, like in areas or rural areas, will not going to be actually punished because that will not enough to trigger the state to actually punish them, to actually take their properties in the very first place, because the amount of their corruption is still not enough to actually trigger the state, right? The comparative that under our rehabilitation will actually, no thank you, rehabilitation will work, right? Because it will actually be applied to all type of corruption, right? So all type of corruption that is actually be seen inside the state, right? That is why secondly, but this rehabilitation even better than impoverishing, right? Because now we don't need actually set a long-term burden for the state, right? Even if we put more capital onto the rehabilitation facilitate, under our side, we actually succeed to actually abolish the root of why these corruptors want to corrupt in the very first place, right? Not under their side, they're only going to provide a more long-term burden, because now these now ex-corruptors will be unemployed and giving more burden to the state, right? But then secondly, on why they're not why their principle is not justified in the very first place. Their side say that their mechanism is going to take more of the loss that the state have from these corruptors. That is not justice. How does the crime justice system works, right? It's what you done is what you gain, right? As punishment. That is why there are death penalty for serial killers, or even jail sentences or fine for thieves, to compensate the state financially, even physically, so that they wouldn't do the crime again behind bars, right? When what I actually stated in the very first place, financial agency cannot actually calculate the exact amount of what amount these corruptors have steal from the state, because there's still human errors or even technical errors, or even these corruptors have a strong link to actually abolish the tracks of corruption that they do in the past, right? That is why this is not justice at all, because they only going to make more miserable justice system in the very first place, right? But then secondly, what I get from the DPM picturization is that, oh, if the corruptor now is rich, then their family will also be rich, right? Noticing that the corruptor want to sacrifice their family, still is not justified because the family didn't do any corruption. But then secondly, the corruptor is still guilty because they use innocent people as sacrifices, right? What we have proven onto this debate is that firstly, side government bench only give more burden to the state, but then secondly, side government did not do any justification at all in their principal case. Therefore so proud to oppose.